Hello there. Today I will talk about Daniel Woods. The first thing I will talk about is some physical qualities, because strength comes before technique, right? Since technique is just an application of strength. So the first thing I will talk about is grip positions. Daniel in particular is usually pretty good in a full grip and open hand grip. One thing that's particular about the way Daniel grabs the holds is that his fingers make a pretty aggressive angle on his knuckle. That's the result of engaging the muscles on the palms of his hands. This is quite different from a lot of climbers like Sean Rabatou or Will Bosey or Hayden Roberts that usually have a pretty straight angle for the knuckles. And this does have an effect on how you climb, because it changes slightly the angle that you can grab the holds and the positioning of your fingers and wrists. And so it also affects the way you engage your shoulders. Other than that, Daniel usually has a pretty strong core and a pretty static style nowadays, although in the past he was a lot more dynamic. He's also usually stronger with bent arms, around like 90, 120 degree lock off. That's usually where he has the most finger strength. On top of all that, he's usually very dominant with the glutes in how he uses his feet. With this information, you already can have a pretty good picture of how he climbs, but there's a lot more to it. So the first climb I will look at is everything Gneiss. It was originally graded V14, and I think it demonstrates Daniel's style really well. So the very first move, starting out, he has hips below the hands, pretty standard, since that makes the position stable because your center of gravity is underneath where you are applying force with your hands. This makes the position very stable. The main thing to pay attention on the first move is the feet. The left foot is the one that keeps him on the wall, while the right foot is the one actually getting him to the hold. Also pay attention to how he has to angle the left foot in a particular way to actually get leverage from the foothold. And this is because on this move, the left leg is mostly pulling and engaging the glutes and hamstrings. And to do that, you have to pull with the tips of your foot, otherwise you just slip. After that, for the second move, he brings a high foot and again pulling with his toes. This would usually be a position where a lot of climbers would use heel hooks, but Daniel with this kind of move will usually use his toes. The main advantages of doing that is that with your toes, you can be more precise than a heel hook. You can pull on smaller and worse feet than a heel hook, and you don't need to readjust once you have done the move. The main disadvantage of this is that you have to get your legs much higher than a heel hook. Especially your knee has to be above the foothold for this to work, which is not the case for heel hooks. For this position, you should also pay attention to his left shoulder, since the closer he gets his chest and hips to his left hand, the less strength he needs to use on his shoulder. He also positions himself with the hips underneath the hold that he is going to. This allows him to be in a good position when he hits the hold and have no movement of the hips and not have to control any momentum. He also keeps his chest very close to the wall the entire time and has to rotate his legs internally to avoid a foot slip. Also, not only on this move, but on basically any hard move on any hard boulder, he has to keep very good core engagement. This also means timing your breathing, since to stabilize your core, you need to create intra-abdominal pressure, basically bracing. The side effect of that is that when you are bracing your core, it's very hard or totally impossible to breathe. For the next move, he bumps his right hand. The first thing to point out is how the momentum of the hips is directed towards the hold he's going to, and also most of the force being applied through his left arm is being done by the triceps. This is not a move where he's pulling, he's just pushing. And this changes very dramatically the way you have to think about these moves. The way I usually think for moves where you are locking off beyond 90 degrees is that you should think of them as leaning on the hold, almost in the same way you would lean over your arms if you do a side plank, for example. For this, you also have to get your chest very close to the wall when you go for the hold, in the same way that having your hips below the hand that you are pulling from or holding makes the position more stable. Having your chest above the hand that is pushing makes the move more stable. After that, next move, he grabs an undercling with his left hand, and now he has a position between the hands. This compression gives him a more stable position to move from, since having opposing forces is one of the easiest ways to have stability when you climb. I will try to explain as to why that is now, and to understand why opposition is something you should always try to get in pretty much any position, and it's something that will make pretty much every move and every position you climb on more stable. you have to understand the physics behind it. So when you climb and when you have to hold any position, the most fundamental thing you need is to create forces that when they add up everything, it counters gravity. So it's equal and opposite in direction to gravity, or higher ideally, right? And that is necessary. There's no way to hold a position if you don't produce more force than the gravity that is pulling you down. And if you look at the way that gravity is applied on your body, it pulls your body down with a constant acceleration through every part of your body evenly. This means every part of your body is being accelerated down with an equal amount of acceleration. This also means that the amount of force is going to be bigger in the parts with more mass and smaller in the parts with less mass. When you add everything up, this means that the final force that you can get, like the average of, will be around downwards and under your center of gravity, or under your center of mass. And the center of mass, you get it by adding up all the mass of your body and getting the average essentially. And then the human body, that is around the hips. And the force of gravity is equivalent to your mass of your body times the acceleration. So when you climb, you have to always create enough force from the holds so that when they all add up, it will be upwards, above your center of gravity, and at least equal to your weight or higher. Another thing is that the center of gravity can change depending on how you position your body. So where you apply the force, or where the resulting force needs to be, can change depending on how you position yourself, right? So if you think about how can you create forces that counter gravity, usually the easiest way and most efficient would be to create force directly upwards over your center of gravity. So this is why I also emphasize so much to get your hips under the holds, because most holds that you grab when you climb, you apply force upwards. And so if your hips are under the hold, you are applying force directly above the center of gravity. And so you counter the force of gravity the most directly and the most efficiently. Because if you apply force to the side, suddenly the force is trying to push you away from the holds or not directly getting you up, which is why it's inefficient. Now, the reason why opposition is so important is because not every hold will allow you to generate force directly up. If you grab a jug, usually you can generate force up regardless of the position that you are, or regardless of the angle that you're holding it from. But with crimps or slopers, the directions where it's possible to produce force is limited by the direction of the hold. So for example, if you have a crimp that you're pulling on sideways on its own, since it's not being directly up, and since it's also outside of the line of your center of gravity, the force that you're pulling on that hold, maybe you can get a little bit of it to be up, but it accelerates you off the wall. Then you might think, well, if you have the hold pulling in one direction and you have opposition pulling in an opposite direction, wouldn't the forces just cancel each other out, right? So how would you pull up if both of the forces cancel each other out? It's not intuitive. And the reason why that doesn't happen is because of friction. So for example, if you are in an overhang and you grab a crimp, the direction that you apply force with your fingers is perpendicular to the surface of the hold. So if you think about an overhang, this means you would be pulling yourself away from the wall and you would just go flying off, right? And without friction, that would be the case. Although without friction, you would probably just slip off the hold, but that's not the point. The reason in real life that doesn't happen is because even though you apply force perpendicular to the hold, which is pulling you away from the wall and off the wall, the way friction works is to generate force in the opposite direction that essentially your finger is trying to move. So if you pull on a crimp, your finger wants to slip and it wants to go down, but friction applies force resisting that in the opposite direction. So in this case, friction pulls you towards the wall. And again, if you think about the overhang, pulling you towards the wall is up, and so it counters gravity. This is why it's possible to hang on an overhang with just like a one-arm hang, for example, without slipping, because friction is generating force up and towards the wall, which is opposite of what your hands are trying to do with trying to slip. The amount of friction you get is dependent on the amount of force you apply on the hold, right? It's proportional to the normal force, which is just the force that the surface applies on your fingers as a reaction to the force that you're applying on the hold. And the direction of the normal force is always perpendicular to the direction of the surface. So once you add the friction that is resisting the direction your skin and your fingers are trying to move and trying to slip towards, now it makes sense why opposition allows you to hold the positions, so create force that counters gravity in a way that is stable. Because now the side vectors, the force that is being applied that is not directly vertical or that is sideways or that would generally be pulling you away from the wall, gets negated, while the upwards force that is created by friction is not. And on top of that, by having opposing forces, a lot of the time you can control how much you pull on each side, which means you can control where essentially the center of the force being applied is, which means you can get the force to be applied over the center of gravity, which again will make the position stable. Another reason why it creates stability is that if you control very subtly how you generate the force and the direction that you can pull. You can generate force maybe a bit to one side or a bit to another side to counteract any movement that you have or any momentum you have. So it's not just about generating force up, you can also generate force to a specific direction if that is what you need. So this is why you should always try to find a way to get opposition when you climb, in any position, regardless if it's opposition between the hands or the feet or of everything, of pulling in this opposite directions or pushing or really any way of getting a position will usually make the positions more stable. And not just that, but a lot of the time it's what you need to even be able to hold the position in the first place. From there, he repositions his feet and gets his hips under the right hand. Again, having the center of gravity under the hold you're pulling, especially if it's a hold that pulls vertically, makes the position more stable. While keeping his hips under the right hand, he puts a toe hook on the right, again to create opposition, since that creates stability. And then he grabs the left hold and repositions the right foot. Here, notice the left shoulder is pulling away from the wall. This is something that later he changes so he can get better lat engagement. This is something about Daniel's style where he just prefers positions where he can engage his lats better. And then once he releases this feet, pay attention to how he repositions his hip before he releases the feet, where he tries to navigate this position of keeping the center of mass under the hold, because that's the only way that is stable to stay on these holds. And he only releases the feet once his center of mass is under the left hand and he has some lat engagement, although not 100% yet. Despite the final moves not being very hard, he still keeps good body tension and moves from efficient positions. So the next boulder I will talk about is Defying Gravity, that was first ascended by Daniel and created V15. I also think this boulder demonstrates Daniel's style really well, since he does it with a very different beta from everyone else that did it. So the first move, he just pulls off the ground and positions his right foot. What I want you to pay attention here is how even on such a simple move, he still keeps good core engagement. He is not being lazy about it, which is something you usually see on intermediate climbers. He always keeps his center of gravity as much as possible underneath the hold, even when he has no foot, or after putting the foot, he still keeps that. Again, just moving through efficient positions, even if it's not a difficult move. After that is the first real move of the boulder. In this move, you can pay attention first to his feet that are in opposition, again, using the principle of creating a position to generate stability, because Daniel really likes to climb more static and stable. So he tends to gravitate to this kind of footwork where you squeeze with your legs in between the holds. This requires a lot of engagement of your adductors and glutes, where Daniel has a lot of strength. With this established, pay attention to the movement of his hips. They move in a trajectory towards the hold that he's aiming for, while also getting his hips close to the wall and still keeping the center of gravity almost underneath the right hand. On top of that, the direction his right hand is pulling is basically a straight line towards the hold he's aiming with his left. When you add up everything, it leads to a very static, stable move, basically just good body tension, which is the kind of thing that Daniel is really good at. Then he repositions his right foot, and here there's a lot of things to pay attention to. The first is how he engages his shoulder on the left hold. When he first hits the hold, he grabs it with a straight arm, in part because of his own strengths, but also because the hold is just really bad. He has to engage his biceps, shoulders, lats to be able to effectively pull on the hold. In terms of pulling on this hold, pay attention how the direction of pulling is towards the hold that he's aiming for with the right hand. With this kind of move, I find useful to visualize an imaginary line going through the hold you're pulling to the hold that you're aiming, and that usually has the effect of making the move feel the most efficient, since you don't waste any strength pulling in a direction that is not useful to what you're trying to achieve, right? Because when you climb, the goal is to get to the next hold, and so it's best to not waste your strength pulling in a direction that doesn't get you where you want to go to. On top of that, for this move, he also gets his center of gravity underneath the right hold, and if you think about it, by having the hips under the right hold, you could think that it's inefficient, since usually it would be better to have your hips under the hold you're pulling with, but in this case, it's mostly because he probably doesn't have any feet on the left that he could use that would allow for that, which is why he has to push really hard with the right hand. Even though it's not the main hand that he's using to pull, he has to generate as much force as he can with that as a result of the positioning of his hips. Because his hips are under the right hand, if you just think about the physics of it, this means that the right hand is the one that has the ability to generate force directly over the center of gravity, and so it can push his body up without spinning, without generating a torque. Another thing to note on this move is how this is pretty much a controlled fall, because the left hold is so terrible. He doesn't have any proper stable or static movement. He just has to throw himself to the hold and then catch the next hold. For catching this move, pay attention first how he keeps his foot on the foothold for as long as possible. Partially because he was probably trying to not lose his feet in the first place, but also because it's just a way of reducing the swing, especially because of the left hand, which is really bad. If he had too much swing on this move, it would be very easy for the left hand to slip. On top of that, pay attention to the trajectory of his hips, how they go in pretty much a straight line up towards the hold that he's going to. Regardless whether he has his foot on the wall or when he cuts loose, he keeps the hips under the hold that he was catching. Having the hips move in this kind of trajectory just makes so that you have very little swing to control, and so that you are in a good position when you catch the hold. Because with moves on really bad holds like this one, you want to do them in a way that will put you in the best position to catch the hold, since that is usually the crux. After this, he has a few easy moves, just readjusting on the holds. Even though the moves are not very hard, Daniel still tries to be very precise, tries to grab the holds really well and spends his time trying to adjust them, which can have both a positive and negative effect. Because if you spend too much time adjusting the holds, you spend more time on the wall, and so you waste more energy. But if you don't grab the holds properly, that can have a compounding effect where every move starts to feel worse and worse, and then you get to the actually hard moves and you're just off position, everything feels bad, your body tension is not working quite as well anymore. You also increase the chance of your hands just slipping, or just being off position or something like that, and then just fail the boulder. So being careful and slow when grabbing the holds can be very good for grabbing them in the best way possible, especially climbing on rock where the holds can be quite complex, and the way you grab them, where you position each finger, can make quite a difference to how they feel, since you get the most amount of friction, but it also wastes energy. So the ideal would be to go as fast as possible without losing any precision, which is a small fault in Daniel's climbing, where he's just really slow, despite being very good and very precise. Once he matches the next hold, then there's a jump. For this move, pay attention first how he positions himself before the jump, and hopefully at this point should be obvious to also look at the trajectory of his hips. For this jump, I think it's quite interesting how Daniel does it almost without using his legs that much. He's quite glute dominant and he doesn't have that much strength on his quads, and you usually see that reflected where he struggles with slab climbing, for example, which is very quad dominant, while doing way better with more overhanging or even roof climbing, and this jump is no exception. The way that he's using his legs is basically just pulling with his glutes, getting his hips close to the wall, and pretty much just pulling with his arms as much as he can to get to the next hold. There's not that much vertical momentum being created by his legs. Once he does the jump, he just has to catch the hold. Here you can pay attention to the way he positioned his chest when catching the move, where he gets his chest into the wall, because this way he can keep pressure on the left hand so that it won't slip. Basically keep the movement stable. Then he does some pretty static campusing, again always following basic principles to keep the movement efficient, like keeping the center of gravity under the hold and etc. The end is a lot easier, so there's nothing too special about it, except maybe for how slow he climbs it, but that also is in part because he has a fear of heights. So you see with Daniel a lot of the time when he gets pretty high on a boulder, quite a bit of hesitation. The idea would obviously be to just not have any fear of heights or anything like that, but given the situation, I think he handles it pretty well, being patient and not rushing the move, making sure he climbs it well despite the fear that he has. The next climb I will talk about is Witness the Fitness, which is a V15 first ascended by Chris Sharma. The first obvious thing about this boulder is that it's a roof climb, and so the way you have to climb is a little different from just a regular overhang, although a lot of the same principles still apply. Something else is that it's a very long climb, and so it's a test of power endurance. This means that a lot of the moves are not that difficult individually, which is quite common for roof climbing, because of the way holds are formed on the rock and because of the angle. If the holds were just too terrible, it would be straight up impossible to do. And so it's actually quite rare to find extremely tiny holds or extremely hard moves on roof climbing, and a lot of the harder roofs, they tend to be power endurance, just because if the holds were just too bad on a roof, it would get completely impossible very easily. So for a boulder like this, the tactics you use becomes very important, since it has 14 moves before the crux, and most of these moves are pretty similar in difficulty, so the climbing is quite constant. This means that the execution depends on not letting the mistakes accumulate or inaccuracy accumulate, because that tends to be the limiting factor in this kind of boulder, is making small inaccuracies in how you move and having that compound over time, and then you get to the crux and you have no more energy left. So starting the boulder, he begins on a jug, then is a small move with the right hand to a good crimp. Pay attention to how even on very easy moves, the principles I've been talking about here still apply to it. He still keeps center of gravity under the holds that he's pulling with, and Daniel in particular always positions himself in a way to engage his glutes as much as possible. And on a roof I think that's very evident. The angle of his knees and hips are the way that they are so that he can get the most glute and hamstring engagement. Then for the next section, Daniel climbs the moves basically one hand at a time and very static. He basically leans into one hand and then moves, leans into one hand and then moves, and so on. The advantage of climbing this way is that you can position your center of gravity under the hold that you're hanging and be able to always find a stable position in that, because if you pay attention when he straightens his arm and hangs on the position, it's very, very stable. This means you can grab the holds well, you can have control over the movement, be stable, so that you're not going to randomly slip or fall on an easy move because you missed it or something like that. With the obvious disadvantage being that you have to have strength in one hand at a time, which means you need more strength on the fingers compared to trying to always have two hands at a time on the wall, or just dead pointing from one position to another. Although, if you have good endurance and power endurance, this means you have a good opportunity to rest the hand that is not grabbing anything. Something else to be noted is the technique for climbing with high feet. For example, in this move, he only releases the right hand only after getting underneath the left hand as much as he can. The other thing to pay attention on this initial sequence is the way that he uses this smearing foot to manipulate his center of gravity. Because even though it's a roof and the foot that is smearing, the only thing that it can actually do is just push him away from the wall. Since it's not vertical or a small overhang, it doesn't have the ability to push him up or where he wants to go, other than maybe with a little bit of friction. But what it really does is to allow him to get his hips under the holds that he's holding. Because without the proper positioning of the off foot, it would be impossible to have the proper positioning of the hips. Once you start to understand this, then you can start to climb through these easy sequences pretty much mechanically, which is something I think Daniel does quite a lot, is to have this pretty mechanical style of climbing. Especially on easier moves is basically something that once you understand the rules and how it works, the way you move can become pretty formulaic, whereas just do a move, hang from one hand, position your center of gravity under the hand, do the next move and repeat and do that for every single move. And then you position your feet in a way to get the center of gravity under the hold, and then just repeat that for every easy move and not really have to think about each individual move that much, which means you can focus on having the entire sequence be efficient. Then you get to the crux, which is basically two moves. This first dead point where he cuts loose on kind of a compression, but not really, since the right hand is not facing away from the hold that he grabs. Even though it is compressing, it's not quite exactly that, since on a compression with an undercling, the way you would generate for the move would be a bit different, because the undercling would have the potential of pulling you away from the hold you're trying to go. Basically, an undercling can just snap you and pull you down if you don't generate properly or with the right timing. So then you kind of have to do the move without actually pulling on the undercling. But obviously, you still have to pull on the hold because otherwise you just can't stay on the wall. In this case, it's not that much of a problem since his hand is basically sideways towards the hold that he's going to and compressing. This means he can engage his biceps to compress, but still in the middle of the move still push with his triceps, so he doesn't have that problem of just getting locked in the middle of the move, or in this case have the right hand snap him back in the middle of the jump. Having the hold in this kind of position also means it's a balance between the compression and just pushing down with his triceps. And then there's the contact strength for catching the hold, and that comes both from just having the finger strength and having your nervous system be very wired. This is something you will develop both through climbing but also training. For example, you can do certain exercises on a hangboard or a campus board to improve the rate of force development. By doing exercises that make you generate a lot of force in a very short period of time can increase the RFD. In terms of just the pure physical aspect, there is also muscle fascicle length, which is usually developed with eccentric exercises. For example, with eccentric movements, you can increase the muscle fascicle length by increasing the amount of sarcomeres in series that you have in your muscle. And that means that each individual sarcomere can contract a shorter amount, but the full muscle contracts the same amount. This means you can get the same length of contraction in a shorter amount of time. So you can improve the RFD without changing anything neurally, but purely through changes in the muscle. The neural aspect of generating an electrical signal very quickly. But then you also have the timing for your breathing and for when you engage your core and when you engage each muscle. And this coordination is something you really can only develop by doing the sport, in this case by climbing, although it does require you to be deliberate about how you move and how you climb. And this is also true in any sport that you do, regardless if it is climbing or running or sprinting or jumping. The principle is the same for any explosive or coordinated movement. Also, when you do these kinds of moves, you need to be in the correct mental state of commitment and confidence, because having good contact strength when you climb is not just the fingers that are engaging quickly, but also your core and shoulders and lats, pretty much your whole body. And they don't just engage when you touch the hold. There's also something called pre-contraction, which is something you see in elite rock climbers, but it is something you can also see in pretty much any elite athlete or in any sport where there's a contact with the ground or a jump, where you have high degree of muscular engagement before contact. So this would mean for someone that is a jumper, before they touch the ground, they jump, they get very close to the max voluntary muscular contraction they would reach in the contact with the ground before making contact. So while they are still in the air from the penultimate step, pretty much as anticipation for the contact, they get very close to max voluntary contraction. Obviously, this means they can generate more force more quickly than if their muscle only started to engage once it touches the ground or after. This is one of the things that allow jumpers to handle forces that are up to 5, 10, or even 20 times their body weight, regardless if it is 1 foot jumping or 2 foot jumping. Also consider that a lot of the force is being generated eccentrically, and the tendon is being stretched like a spring, and then that elastic energy is being used to generate impulse and force on the jump. This means that the higher the tendon stiffness, the more energy they can store and the higher they jump. In climbing, what we want is to just prevent the tendon from being stretched, since that would cause your fingers to just open up, but it actually in practice is the same as training for jumping, where you just want very high tendon stiffness. And the way you develop tendon stiffness, not just on the fingers, but anywhere, is just strength training. Since tendons don't have the ability to contract on their own, this means that the type of contraction doesn't matter. So it could be concentric, isometric, or eccentric. The effect is basically the same for the tendons. And the only things that really matter is just the load, the tension, the time, and the practicality of whatever exercise that you're doing. Since generally, more simple exercises are easier to stick to and just take less time to do. For example, hangboarding and doing one-arm hangs is a lot more practical than pulling weight from the ground. With a one-arm hang, you can just get to the gym and do it right away. If you want to do the same load but pulling it from the ground, you have to load up 50, 60, 70 kilos before you even start getting the load you would get for a one-arm hang. So I think practicality is a very important aspect of exercise selection. Going back to talk about tendon stiffness, basically this is just a complicated way of saying that the stronger your fingers, the better your contact strength, which is quite obvious, but I think understanding the reason why that is the case can be quite useful. Since if you can understand what you are trying to achieve metabolically with your training, you can be a lot more objective and goal-oriented when you create your training programs. Now, talking about pre-contraction again, it should be understood that it is not a conscious action that you can do. It is a result of repetition and familiarity with the movement patterns that you're doing and unconsciously developing this engagement. But it is also something that requires confidence so that you can commit to a very high impact without hesitation, because hesitation will prevent your muscles from engaging the maximal amount or engaging quickly. As for developing confidence, there are many things that you can do. Probably the first and most obvious is physical training and conditioning, because if you don't feel that your body is prepared for what you're trying to do in a sport, then it's going to be impossible to have confidence. So physical preparation is one way to improve that, but then obviously there's the mental training you can do, and this comes down to reflecting on what prevents you from having confidence or what causes hesitation. Very often hesitation will come from fear, such as the fear of injuries or failure or something else. And if you can recognize that fear and understand what is causing it or whatever else is causing your hesitation, then you will have to reflect on whether that's valid or not. Because if you're doing something like a triple jump and your body is just not conditioned for it, you do have a very high chance of injuring yourself. So being afraid of injury, if you really are not prepared for a movement, is not really invalid, right? And then it can even be good to have this hesitation so that you don't injure yourself. But a triple jump is a quite exceptional example, since it's pretty easy to rupture your Achilles or your patella or break a bone even. But climbing a lot of the time is not that extreme, since usually the only thing we injure is the fingers or shoulders, unless you just fall like really awkward or twist your ankle or something like that. So then you have to address whatever is causing you hesitation. This means that if your fingers are not very strong or they don't have that much resilience and you're afraid of committing to a dead point or some dynamic move because you're afraid of hurting yourself, you have to reflect on whether that is the case really or not. And if that is the case, then you should probably train and condition your body so that it won't be anymore and improve your confidence as a result of that. In climbing, there's also the fear of falling, which can be justifiable or not, especially bouldering outdoors. You can twist your ankle or fall in an awkward way depending on how the crash pads are placed. But a lot of people also have fear of falling sport climbing or in a gym or from very low heights, or in a lot of situations where that really is not justifiable since the risk is just very low. In that case, you should learn the techniques for falling the best that you can. You should learn how to use your equipment sport climbing, or how to position the pads, how to use spotters and all those things so that you can minimize the risk. And if the risk is very low and you still feel hesitation when falling, then you should probably practice falling a lot. And if that doesn't help, you have then to realize how fear is just an illusion. It is completely created by your mind. It has no substance or any solidity, like a mirage in the desert or something like that. This is something you can understand through meditation or just reflection. If that still doesn't work and you still have fear of falling, or you have hesitation even when there is no risk, then you have to realize that you're probably just overthinking. And the solution for that is to just be a bit more stupid and dumb and just think less about whatever you're thinking. Because sometimes the problem that you have is very simple, but it just feels complicated because you make it complicated. And a lot of the time climbing is the same. You realize that you just don't need to do anything special. Basically, just not really think about and commit to the move. But in the context of physical conditioning, if you feel hesitating to do a move because you're afraid of hurting yourself or injuring your fingers or something like that, you have to really wonder if that is the case. And then you have to think about how your body feels. If your fingers feel tweaky or not, think about the grip position of the move, how risky it actually is, since some positions are obviously going to be injured more easily, like monos, for example. How much have you climbed during the session and how high was the intensity? You will probably realize that most of the time you just hesitate on a move for no good reason, even though you're completely capable of doing it. And in that case, you just have to realize that you're being kind of lazy and just get the move done. If that is not the case and you're just too tired or too weak to do a move, in that case, physical training is the solution if you're too weak. And if you're too fatigued, you just have to rest. There's nothing special to do. Except some climbers don't really know when to take a step back and chill, partially because they might have this mistaken idea that just the more they train, the better they will get, which is not necessarily true. Then the problem is recognizing that pattern and fixing it. At the end of the day, the way you improve, and not just climbing, but anything, is figuring out whatever the limiting factor to what you're trying to achieve is, and then finding the method for fixing these limiting factors, and then fix and correct the limiting factors towards that as quick as you can and as frequently as you can. So very often the problem you will find when trying to improve in climbing or any sport or anything is not a problem of effort, but a problem of conceptual understanding of how to improve. You gain that by studying the people that are very good through self-reflection or practice, or just study in general, which is the purpose of these videos that I'm making. So now once he gets this first dead point, there's the second crux move. For this, he brings the feet up, and here he can create opposition between the right foot and the toe hook. Pay attention to how he positions his hips and his legs in a way that maximizes the force he produces with the muscles in the legs. In this move, more important than having, say, a positioning that is efficient, like trying to get the hips under the hold, it is better to try and just be in the position where you generate the most force, since this position in particular is never going to feel that easy, regardless of how you position your body. Here, the way he positions his right leg is to try and get an angle to generate the most amount of force downwards, and for the left leg he positions so that he gets the most amount of surface area for the toe hook. Then he engages the shoulder on the left arm, again in a way that will allow him to generate force downwards and to try and engage these muscles as much as possible. And then the positioning of the hip is in the middle between the feet and the hand, since the amount of force he generates with his hand and with his foot is pretty similar. You know, you can think about it, maybe 50% of his body weight or something like that. The hip ends up being balanced almost in the middle, and depending on how much weight he puts on the hold versus the feet will change that balance and will change the positioning of the hip. But for this move in particular, since he just wants to be stable and have a static movement, he stays in the middle with the hips. And then from this position, which is very hard to hold and that requires a lot of engagement to just stay in position, he moves to the next hold and hits the hold. Once he hits this hold, you can see that there's a huge shift in the positioning of his hips and his arms, and that's because the balance of the forces changes. And then he gets his chest underneath the hold and straightens his arms, and then as a result he also straightens the leg a lot. Then here he has to use the toe hook to the best of his ability to avoid cutting loose, which can be quite tricky to do since his legs are almost fully straightened out, which means that applying force is harder since the muscle is on a lengthened position, which makes it a harder lever to pull with the muscle, with the hamstring in particular. And so this kind of move, when you have to keep tension with really straightened legs, is very often about just having the right amount of swing, and in this case even using your arms to try and pull yourself towards the feet rather than pull yourself up, so that you can put a little bit more pressure. Here he has also a toe hook that helps a lot, but generally this kind of move is about precision and how you control the trajectories and how you control the momentum. And in this case in particular with the toe hook, by also trying to create as much of position as possible between the foot that is pulling down with the glutes and hamstrings and the toe hook which is pushing up with hip flexors. And then he releases the toe hook, and this is a move where you can see where he fails once he releases that, because without the toe hook there is nothing pushing him towards the feet anymore. The way you avoid a foot slip here is a combination of good body tension, keeping good core engagement, and this is something that if you climb through the entire sequence more efficiently, it means that you will be less fatigued on the core, so you will be able to engage it better. But then it's also about just moving very precisely through the positions, so you don't get too much underneath the hold and then get too far away from the feet and just slip. And then use your hands kind of the reverse of a front lever, where you push it upwards so that you can get the hips closer to the feet, and then you can actually generate some opposition between the hand and the feet. Even though the feet is pushing you up, you push with your hands in the opposite direction, and you're never going to be able to generate that much force this way, but it's still a little bit. That just helps avoid losing the feet. Then he repositions the left foot, and he has a very in-cut feet on the left now. From there it's a lot easier to move, so he just matches the hand, cuts loose, and moves on to the next holds. And I think from this position on it's like V6. So for someone that is as good as Daniel, if he doesn't make any big mistake, which even Daniel or a lot of strong climbers can still make on these easier boulders, if it's a flash attempt or onside, or if they're just not too familiar with it, or maybe a style that they're not good, like slab, or if it has like very dynamic moves, you can sometimes just miss the hold. Or maybe if you have bad conditions and the holds are wet, could still cause a strong climber to fall on an easier boulder. In this case, since this is a boulder that he has already tried quite a bit and he has pre-dialed, the chance of him falling here is pretty much zero. So for this sequence, I encourage you to pay attention to how he climbs on jugs and easy moves, and notice how even on a very easy boulder, everything that you apply to the difficult moves still apply to the easy moves, such as how you position your center of gravity, the trajectory that you have with your hips, the ways that he engages his glutes and his hamstrings and pulling on the feet are still the same, even if the moves are very easy. The point I'm trying to make is that the things that I'm trying to discuss and explain here are not meant to just be useful if you're climbing V14 or V15. Even on a V6, the principles are still the same. So the next boulder I will talk about is Radja, which is a V14 first ascended by Fred Nicole and was the first V14 in the world. So the first thing to pay attention in this boulder is the way that you use your feet on these first moves, and this is because since the feet and the hands have opposition, and also because you're smearing with the feet, this means that you cannot use your glutes that much. Since there is nothing in-cut on the feet, you have to push with the feet and then use the opposition to stay on the wall, rather than just pulling down with the hands and pushing down with the feet and then generating force upwards. Here you generate the force almost in opposite directions and a little bit up, and when you add the friction on top of that, it allows you to stay on the wall. And look at the angle that he has for the right feet and the way that he steps on the hold to get the most amount of surface area. Then once he does this first move and he has the hold, since the hold is in cut now and it's pulling vertically, he can kind of just hang on the holds and then readjust the left foot. This is something that requires applying force with the hands to get the hips in the position. Since the right foot, the only thing that it can really do is push. Because of the shape of the foothold, it's not possible to apply force with the feet in a way that gets his hips more to the left, and so all of that force comes from the hands. Then once he positions the left foot, since the foothold that he's using now is zinc cut, he can just pull with the left leg and engage his glutes and hamstrings. Then here he gets the hip under the right hand and then twists a little bit, and he can still get to the next hold. This is because the moves are very small. And then this entire next sequence is just this twisting that he does. This allows him to move and get to the next holds while still keeping the hips under the hands. This means that he has both the stability and the efficiency of having the center of gravity under the hold while still being able to do the move. This style of climbing works really well when you have easier sequences that don't really have really big moves. Climbing this way allows you to do the moves the easier way, that requires the least amount of strength without having to sacrifice stability or consistency, so that you won't be missing a move by accident or anything like that. The only thing that this doesn't allow is to do big moves, right? Since you're always limiting yourself to just twisting under the most stable position. This very often will not be possible on very hard moves, exactly because this is what makes them hard, right? Since the moves are hard exactly because you can't really do this, and you have to move way beyond the positions that feel stable or way beyond the positions that feel easy. After this, he has two shoulder moves. First with the left hand. On this hand, pay attention to how he pinches the hold. This pinching a crimp is something that Daniel does a lot. You will often see him trying to pinch pretty much any hold that he grabs. There are a few advantages to this. The biggest one is that it creates opposition within the hold, so this way you don't need to use some different hold or a foot to create opposition, and you have opposition being created from a single hold. This means that you can generate force in whatever direction that you pull or push with your hand, and even generate force in a direction that wouldn't be possible for the hold otherwise. For example, on the left hand here, he's able to generate force downwards by pinching the hold. If he wasn't pinching the hold, then he would only be able to generate force perpendicular to the hold. That would mean he would need more opposition from the right hand or the right foot to stay on the wall. But since here, because of pinching the hold, he can just pull down with the left. That is not as necessary, and so he can move through this position more easily. Having said that, that doesn't mean that you should pinch every single hold or that it's always better to pinch the holds, since there is still a few disadvantages to it. One of them being that your thumb limits your movement. Since for a pinch you have to have the thumb locked in place, this means that the angles that you can move your wrist and your shoulders become more limited, and very often they become more extreme. For example, even on this move for the left hand, by pinching the hold, he puts his shoulder in a more extreme angle with more rotation. For example, you can visualize on this left hand, if he didn't pinch the hold, it might be possible to get his shoulders and elbows pulling a bit more vertically, having more lat engagement, and depending on the hold, that can be better. Here, that's probably not the case, but that's something you should consider. It shouldn't just be something you always do to try and pinch the holds, because I know there's people that are like that, right? They just pinch everything they can and never consider that that's not necessarily the best in every move, since by pinching the hold, you force your thumbs and as a consequence, force your wrists and shoulders into particular positions that very often are harder to hold, especially if it's a more vertical hold. If you think about when you pinch a hold, it's better if the hold is vertical, like pinching a side pull, for example, and the more horizontal and the more shoulder move it becomes, the harder it is to pinch, since it starts to get harder to get your thumb in position. This will also depend on your own strengths, since if someone is stronger at pinching, they might benefit more from it. Also might depend on the flexibility you have on your thumb, especially if it's a shoulder move, and also depending a bit on the shape of the hold, you might need some contortionism for your thumbs. Still talking about this move, pay attention to the right foot and the way that he's using it. How on this move in particular, he has to keep his right foot locked in place pretty much. Even when he brings the high foot with the left and he has to readjust his position, he doesn't rotate his right foot. Instead, he rotates the leg while keeping the foot locked in place. And you do this by twisting your knee and twisting your hip while keeping your foot, and in particular, the way your shoe is touching the hold, locked in place. The reason he does that is because in this move in particular, if he were to rotate his feet too much, he would just slip. And this is because every foot, and especially the feet that you find outdoors that are really bad, has an ideal positioning for the shoe that will give you the most amount of friction, or that will have the crystals of the hold dig into your shoe the most and allow you to get the most leverage or generate the most amount of force. And depending on the shape of this foot and how bad it is, it will force you to have a certain position with your shoes and your feet, where if you go too far from this position that works, then your foot just slips. Here you can visualize if you were to rotate his foot, so the outside of the shoe would be touching the hold, the foot would just slip, and it's just impossible to use this foot hold with the outside of the shoe, because this foot that he's using here is blocked on top, so the outside of the shoe would not get into the foothold, so he has to use the tip of the shoe to actually get anything out of this foothold. This is a kind of move where being careful can be quite useful, so that you move precisely through the positions, and this is something that Daniel is quite good at. Then once he has the high foot, he grabs an intermediate undercling and then readjusts the feet. He gets the left foot where he was using as a hand. Because it's in cut, he can engage his glutes and hamstrings again, and with the right hand he has to push down with the shoulders and triceps to be able to get to the next undercling. Since the hold and the feet is in cut, this is the kind of move which is usually just limited by body tension and tricep strength, because if he's not able to push down enough and keep a connection with his entire body, then he won't get enough distance for the next hold, because the next move is bigger, so it's not something he can just stay on a stable position and still be able to reach the hold, right? Although notice how he still is using the twisting of his torso to try and generate force for the right hand. If he was more square to the wall, he would need a bit more pushing and a bit more strength for the triceps. Twisting here puts his shoulder in a position that pushes a bit just passively, but that also gets his left hand closer to the undercling so he can reach further. Now here, this undercling move is the crux of the boulder. Notice here how it's also a 3-finger crimp on the undercling. Since the hold is very bad, this limits how you can move through the position. Pay attention here, once he puts the right foot, look at the positioning of his hips, and bumping his left foot, he has to create opposition for the undercling. So you can see how he twists his hip up, he twists his leg up. This is to try and create force that goes against the undercling so that he can stabilize. Since for climbing on underclings, the feet are just important as the hands, since it's basically impossible to stay on an undercling with just your hands. So it's a hold that requires opposition to work. But in this position, when he's bumping the left foot, you can tell that it's a very bad position and he can barely stay there. This is because before he gets his left foot on the good foothold, he just doesn't have that much opposition on the undercling. So he has to use the right hand to stay on the position, but the right hand here is just pushing, and so again it's just never going to be that stable, especially since here the foot is pretty much at the same level of the hand. This is the kind of move where being prepared for it and being efficient throughout your climbing to save energy is very important, since the way that you hold these types of positions is by having a lot of core engagement. So here timing your breathing to get the proper bracing before you try to initiate the movement makes a huge difference. And then once he has the left foot, there's a noticeable shift in the positioning. The way it can be described is very often saying that someone is climbing through certain boxes. Here you can see very clearly him entering a box where it's very stable, where before he had to try pretty hard to get to the hold and to move. Once he has the right box, then it's just like effortless. And climbing technique is a lot about finding these boxes and moving through them and minimizing the time that you spend outside these boxes. And once he enters this position, he can get his hips under the undercling, the feet generate good force, and he's very stable, so he can just lock off the left and goes to the right hold. One thing about this move and the way Daniel does it is that he goes statically to the hold. His arm is also locking off in a bent position, and this is also a one arm lock off. This makes the move very stable but requires a lot of strength. Another way someone could do this move that might make it more efficient and require less strength but maybe a bit more low percent would be, for example, to straighten the arm completely before moving off the undercling. This means you don't need to go from a bent elbow to a straight elbow while holding the undercling, since that requires a lot of strength on your biceps. And very often you have this thing with underclings where if you lock off say 90 degrees and then you try to straighten your arm, it can be very hard to fully straighten the elbow, since the contraction of your bicep can cause it to be stuck in place and pull you down and prevent you from straightening the arm. Basically comes down to the fact that you are trying to generate force to pull on the undercling by contracting your bicep, but then also trying to extend the elbow by relaxing the bicep, which are opposite movements. This is quite hard for the muscle to do, especially the more extreme the range of motion becomes. But if you straighten the arm first, that requires a lot of finger strength in a straight arm position, but since your arm is already straightened out, you can get the most amount of reach for the move. This is something that a climber like Will Bosey or Sorato, who are both very strong with straight arm, usually are able to pull off. And I find personally that is usually more efficient for very reachy moves, although it requires more finger strength. The other thing that could make this more efficient is to not just lock off in one hand, but to only start moving with momentum once you release the right hand. So you use the right hand to push yourself up towards the hold that you're going to, and then use that momentum to get to the hold and not have to lock off. This is usually how a more dynamic climber would do this move. And if you watch other people doing this same boulder, some people do it that way. In Daniel's case, he does it this way because he just likes to climb very safe and very static. This is also something that I know Daniel has trained specifically to do. They on a spray wall to try and force himself to climb only one hand at a time and try to be very static. So it's not an accident that he climbs in this style. He's very intentional and deliberate about it. Even though this takes more strength because you're locking off one hand at a time, if you can pull it off the way that Daniel does it, it does make the climbing more stable and consistent and static and safe, which is usually what he prioritizes in his style. Then once he grabs this hold, the next move is quite simple. He just readjusts his feet and he has a stable position, and it's not a big move at all. And then after that, the next move is actually interesting since he uses a toe hook to keep the move stable and avoid cutting loose. And this is the type of small detail that can be very useful to look for when you're searching for beta on a climb, since the toe hook is there just to give him a little bit more stability on this move, and it's not really necessary, but it's the kind of thing that just makes these moves more consistent a bit so that you're not going to be dropping them randomly or anything of that nature. So even on easy moves, you should always look for ways to create a position or ways to just create a little bit more consistency, even if it's not necessary or the moves are not that hard. This kind of thing can make a difference in not dropping the boulder outside of the hard sections, not be falling outside of the crux because you make some small mistake or you just missed the hold or anything like that. And then after this move, there's really nothing too special. He just climbs quite careful, which again, Daniel has a pretty careful style in general, so it's not that surprising, especially once the boulders get higher up. It is a very reasonable thing to do to be careful with your style so that you don't fall on an easy move due to carelessness. So the next boulder I will talk about is a comp boulder. Since Daniel did a lot of competitions earlier in his career, he used to have a much more dynamic style than nowadays, and there was a change in how he climbs, especially after he stopped competing and prioritizing rock climbing. So this climb is from the La Sportiva Legends from 2011, and even though the style is much more dynamic, I think you can also still see a lot of the things that make Daniel's style very distinct. Even back then, a lot of his habits were basically the same, and a lot of the strengths and preferences that he has were still the same. So I think it's interesting to look at someone who nowadays is mainly a rock climber, how they approach this comp style. So the first move is pretty straightforward compression. Pay attention here how the right foot, there's a drop knee, and the direction that this right foot is applying force is towards the left hand, and the left foot is pushing towards the next hold, and the hips also move towards the next hold. This way, he creates opposition for stability and apply forces towards the next hold at the same time, which makes the move efficient and stable. Then he readjusts the foot so that he can get his hips under the right hand and jumps to the next hold. Here, the left foot is applying force towards the hold and the hips are also moving in trajectory towards the hold. At the same time, the right hand stays passive because if he pulls too hard with the right hand or if he has too much tension on the bicep or the muscles on the arm, it will shorten his reach and pull him away from the hold that he's trying to go to. So he has to keep the muscles somewhat relaxed or in a way where they don't change the length so much so that he can maximize the reach for the move until he hits the next hold, and then he can properly engage it as hard as possible so that he can compress the position and hold the next move. Once he hits the left hold, it's very important for him to engage his entire upper body as fast as possible and also engage his core in the right timing. For these type of dynamic moves, it's very useful to brace in the moment you hit the hold so that your core won't be loose in the critical moment of the move. Then once he hits this move, he releases the right hand, gets his hips under the left hold and does a one arm pull up to the next hold. Here this entire 360 sequence is very interesting since he doesn't do it as one smooth movement but basically as two separate movements of hanging on the hold and then the one arm. This is very different from how a lot of the more modern younger comp climbers would think about it, where they might try to use momentum to turn this into a single smooth movement. But Daniel does it the way an outdoor climber would think about it, of moving through positions, right? He's in the position of compression, then releases the hand, hangs on the position, and does a one arm to the next hold. The intuition he has on his body to move this way is usually what you see on outdoor climbers. This is also why a lot of outdoor climbers struggle a lot with coordinated moves, since to be very good at coordination, you need to have the ability to turn an entire sequence of multiple complex movements into a single smooth motion and ride the momentum to your advantage so that you can do this move the most efficiently and easily without having to just rely on the pure brute force or the strength you have. So here you can see that even back in the day, even when Daniel still focused quite a lot on comp climbing and was training these dynamic coordinated moves much more frequently, the way he was thinking and the way that he was moving was still very similar to an outdoor climber. You also see this way of thinking reflected on his performances, right? Since he has performed much better outdoors than he ever did on comps, and he was competing in a time where the competitions were much more similar to the rock. So nowadays that kind of style and the way that he climbs would not work at all on the more modern recent comps. So you should take into account how you visualize and how you think about the moves depending on what you're trying to climb or what your goals are. This also doesn't mean that this way of thinking is worse, since if you were to think like a comp climber when you climb on very small crimps, you're probably not going to have the best time, right? Since you can't just link the moves together with momentum when the holds are too bad. And then moving from one position to another would generally be the more useful way of thinking, especially if you need to keep body tension or if the feet are also really bad. Then once he does the 360, he goes hips under the right hand so that he can readjust the left and then brings a high foot. From this high foot, the move is quite similar to Witness the Fitness. He does the one arm at a time kind of climbing that he really likes and just goes to the next hold static. Here, pay attention to how he positions his left leg. The flagging that he does here helps manipulate his center of gravity so that it's going to be in line with the right hand and then eventually underneath the right hand, and thus the move hits the next hold. And it's interesting here how he hits the hold with the hips perfectly underneath the right hand. This is not a coincidence, it's just because that is a very stable position to hold. Then readjusts the left hand a few times. Here I think he's trying to grab a crimp better. Then he also repositions himself to get as much to the left as possible, even getting to the limit of how much his right leg can extend. And this, I think, is to get his left arm as engaged as possible. Since Daniel is stronger with bent elbows as opposed to a fully straight arm, he does that so he can have a better position for his muscle to engage so that he can compress the position better. Then cuts loose and puts a heel hook. Then this move is pretty simple, it's just a basic heel hook. Just keep a position, move the hips towards the hold, etc, etc. Then here he tries to get the next heel hook and he struggles quite a bit to do that. And this is the kind of move where having good flexibility will help a lot, and to a certain degree it's necessary to have good flexibility for these kinds of position. Personally, as a training exercise for this type of move and for this kind of position, I find the pancake to be the best, both in terms of gaining hip mobility but also the hamstring mobility you need. It can be a bit of a tricky exercise to learn how to execute properly, and there's definitely a certain barrier of entry for it, but I think if you get good at it, we usually translate the best to this mobility you need for climbing. Once he gets the heel hook, he grabs the previous crimp he was using, now with the right hand. That stabilizes the position quite a bit, and then he can change the heel into stepping with the toes, which again is also something Daniel usually prefers. Then he repositions his left leg. This puts him into a pretty classic shoulder move position. Here, notice how the position of the hip is in the middle point between the left hand and the right foot, and then moves to the next hold. The principle for this kind of move is again just apply force with the hand towards the next hold, apply force with the foot towards the next hold, move the hip towards the next hold, etc. Also notice how the left leg is giving him some momentum on this move. Then the next few moves are pretty straightforward until he gets to the pinch. On this pinch, notice how on the first two moves using it, he's pinching with his thumbs. But then when he grabs it as an undercling, it's basically impossible to get the thumb in a position to pinch it. So instead he uses the flesh underneath the thumb on the palm of his hand to squeeze the hold, on top of being forced into having his arm in a fully straightened position, because from the position he's trying to grab the hold, it's basically impossible to bend his arm, so he has to grab it from a straight arm. On this kind of position here, it can be very awkward to generate momentum or to pull with your arms. You can't really do much with them, so what you're doing with your legs becomes very important. And here he has a drop knee, which is the key on this move, since it gives opposition and stability for the move and also allows him to generate force towards the next hold. Then the next move he hits the hold and has a compression position. On this compression, the right hand is doing quite a lot of work, since the foot and the left hand are both applying force in the same direction. If he didn't have the right hand, he would just go flying off the wall. So here the momentum he generates and also the stability and controlling the momentum all comes from the right hand. So you can see that in the way that he has to bump the right hand to the next hold. The momentum for that comes from the right hand. Then the next move is also a compression, very dynamic. He has a very unstable position, since here without the left hand he would just go flying away to the right. Here I think it's interesting to discuss how you think about moves, because he has a stable position when he's holding both hands, and the final position on the jug is also very stable, but the in-between is extremely unstable. So here you have to move dynamically. Also notice the direction of the holds means you can't control the trajectories in the way you would for most moves, since usually if you're trying to grab a hold with your left hand, your right hand can pull you towards that hold. But here, because of the angle of the right hand can only pull you away from the hold you're trying to get to, right? The same is true for the left hand. Since it's an undercling, you can only pull on that hold in the opposite direction of what you're trying to go to. So all the force that gets you to the hold is coming from the foot, and then you can control how much force you apply on each hand to control how much to the left or to the right you can go. The only thing here is, since he can squeeze the left hand with his palm, he can use it to push himself a little bit, but it's not that much. So for this kind of move, you should learn to develop a balance of how much you are active or passive with each hand to control the trajectories. This also requires you to pay attention to the direction of each hold and where the force that you are applying is moving you to, so you can have efficient movement. And then once he catches the last hold, he does a little coordinated match instead of waiting to stabilize the position before matching, and then it's a jug. There's no way he's falling there. So to sum up Daniel's style a bit, you can say that he's generally very strong at full crimping, and he tends to gravitate towards more static movement, and part of the mentality behind that is trying to feel secure when he climbs and having some slight aversion to risk. And you see that reflected also in the fear of heights that he has. So a lot of the way he moves is the result of trying to feel secure and to have as little risk in the execution of every move. Now, on a more positive note, something that I think is exceptional about Daniel's mentality and is definitely worth noting is that rather than just climbing hard, he also spent a lot of time developing boulders. And most of these boulders he developed were a lot of the hardest climbs in the world and are still today some of the most repeated and climbed hard boulders, from like V14 to V17. And not just searching hard boulders, but also beautiful boulders or impressive lines, and even very big high balls, even though he's quite scared of height. And not just doing this in well-established areas, but also much less frequented areas, and not just in his home country of the US, but also all around the world, in Africa, South America, Europe, etc. And this is not something that a lot of the very strong climbers do, since opening lines in developing areas takes a lot of work, since there's a lot more than just climbing involved. There's cleaning the boulders, finding the boulders, figuring out the beta. You're not even sure if it's possible, and you're not even sure when you go to a new area or somewhere that doesn't have any boulders established if you're gonna find anything good or if you will find anything hard. And this is not something that a lot of the very strong climbers seem willing to put that much effort into, and a lot of them just prioritize prioritize repeating established boulders rather than put all the extra effort to try and find new lines. And part of the reason for that is money, right? Since traveling is expensive. So if you're spending all this time and all this money traveling to trying to climb something hard or something that will please your sponsors, for a lot of professional climbers, it makes more sense to try and repeat things that are established or not take the risk trying to find something new because you're not guaranteed anything in return. So it's not completely unjustified to avoid doing that, but part of what drives someone like Daniel to search for first ascents and search for new boulders is just having passion for adventure and developing an area rather than just seeing climbing as something to try and perform or just try to climb hard or just chase grades or something like that. And more than anything else, Daniel did all of that while still being the best boulder in the world, which is quite tough to do, right? Because if you're traveling and you're developing boulders, you don't have as much time to spend training in the gym, so staying in shape is harder. And if you're trying to develop new boulders, you don't get to climb as much as if you were just repeating lines, so it's also hard to stay in shape even by climbing outdoors this way. So to put pretty much all of his effort and all of his time traveling, developing new lines, and still be the strongest in the world is quite exceptional. And I mean, today, there's definitely people who are stronger than Daniel and better climbers than Daniel. And all around the world, there's people who put loads of effort in developing areas. But having someone that was as strong as Daniel, putting as much effort as he was, the amount of people like that you can count in one hand. And I find that this sense of exploration seems a bit less frequent in the younger generation of very strong climbers. And not necessarily for their fault, since the climbing environment now is very different from what it was 10 years ago. And with social media, being a good athlete or performing better doesn't necessarily mean you make more money, and so all the concerns with putting effort into first ascents are exacerbated by that. So there's definitely a lot of very strong younger climbers nowadays who would be putting effort into first ascents or developing things the way that Daniel was 10 years ago, but they're just too broke. And rather than try and go to an unknown area to try and see if maybe you find some boulder that could be any grade, most of them would rather just repeat established lines and get likes on social media and make money. And even very often the first ascents that you see are boulders that were projects from people like Dave Graham or Daniel from 10, 20 years ago that only now see someone strong enough to do them. But this willingness to go out in the wild and try to find new lines is something that is quite rare, even on very well-established climbers where money is not a problem at all. I mean, in Daniel's generation, you had people like Nale or Jimmy that were very strong climbers, also developing a lot of boulders and developing new areas. Or someone like Seb Boin, who puts pretty much 100% of his time into developing the most beautiful, hardest lines he can find. Or even younger Adam Ondra, who put a lot of effort into outdoor climbing and doing first ascents and developing lines and routes and boulders. These people are quite exceptional in the type of effort that they put outdoors. So even when you look at the professional climbers of their generation who are just as strong or even stronger, a lot of them just don't seem willing to put that effort because it's hard. And you don't necessarily get anything in return. You can put a lot of effort into a first ascent and it just turns out to be terrible. Or you don't do it, or it's just too hard, or it's too easy, or something else, right? So this willingness to throw himself into unknown territory I find very commendable, right? So if there was no one like Daniel or Nale or Jimmy or Ondra or Sharma or Seb, there wouldn't be that many routes or boulders for the strong climbers to do, right? You wouldn't be able to have someone go around and repeat a bunch of hard boulders and improve their climbing and learn from all these beautiful lines if you didn't have people putting in the effort to develop them in the first place. And that takes a lot of effort and very often makes you a worse climber because you don't get to train as much as everyone else, right? So for this, I have to praise not only Daniel, but anyone who puts that effort because I think it's a great thing. Because otherwise there would be no outdoor climbing, right? And in Daniel's case, to be as strong as he was, despite the amount of effort he put into developing lines and doing first ascents and developing areas, is a lot more impressive than if he only spent his time in the gym or repeating boulders or only climbing in well-established areas and things like that. So this is pretty much everything I had to say for Daniel. There's probably more I could say, but for the time being, this is enough. So if you liked this video, consider liking and subscribing, since I do plan on making a lot more videos like this, going in-depth into climbing technique and training. And I still feel like I have said only a fraction of what I have to say. So that's it, and thanks for watching.